The wedding anniversary takes a tragic turn as dark truths come to light, unveiling carefully hidden secrets that transform a night of celebration into an unimaginable nightmare, where love and trust are shattered, giving way to a plot of betrayal and despair that no one could have foreseen. On a warm, captivating evening, Isabella and Eduardo found themselves in a luxurious restaurant, celebrating a milestone in their lives, their wedding anniversary. The ambiance was elegantly decorated, reflecting the significance of the occasion, with sparkling chandeliers and a subtle aroma of exquisite dishes, as if every detail had been meticulously planned to turn the night into a memorable event. The expectations were high, and the couple seemed immersed in a moment of pure enchantment, where smiles and knowing glances were exchanged in harmony. There's something magical about celebrating love, especially in such a majestic setting. Who could have predicted that such a well-planned evening, in an atmosphere of pure celebration, would bring about a series of unexpected events? Life has a curious way of surprising us, and sometimes those surprises aren't exactly what we imagined. Isabella, in the midst of toasting with crystal glasses, began to feel a slight unease. Something about the perfectly orchestrated environment seemed off. It wasn't a matter of decor or service, but rather a palpable sensation, a discomfort that emerged subtly, almost like a whisper in her ear, warning her that something was about to happen. Have you ever felt that, despite a perfect setting, something seems out of place? Isabella certainly felt it. And this is where human instinct often alerts us, even when reason insists on ignoring it. And so, between laughs and touches of hands across the table, Isabella began to notice a discomfort growing in her chest. It was as if the atmosphere of the luxurious restaurant, once cozy, was transforming into something denser, almost oppressive. When the main course was served, succulent shrimp that promised to be the highlight of the evening, the discomfort intensified. At first, Isabella tried to ignore it, thinking it was just nerves or the emotion of the moment. But as she took the first bite, a sharp pain shot through her stomach and fear began to take shape. That sense that something was wrong, which seemed so vague at first, was now becoming clear. Eduardo, always attentive, noticed the worried look on his wife's face and asked if everything was okay. Isabella, trying to keep her composure, smiled, but it was too late to hide her concern. The taste of the shrimp, which she had been eagerly anticipating, now mingled with a bitter feeling of uncertainty. She began to wonder if there was something wrong with the food, if perhaps she had fallen victim to food poisoning. However, what she didn't know was that this night, meant to celebrate love and unity, would become a dark turning point in their lives. Sometimes fate has a peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it? Like when a moment that should be the pinnacle of happiness turns into an unexpected health crisis. As Isabella's discomfort grew, Eduardo, now filled with rising anxiety, called the waiter's attention. The restaurant staff, trained to handle any situation, promptly mobilized to help. The chef was summoned, and the kitchen turned into a zone of investigation, searching for any clue that something might have gone wrong with the dish. However, while the focus was on the shrimp, Isabella's health continued to decline rapidly. The tension increased by the minute, and what started as a mild unease was turning into an uncontrollable crisis. It was as if time was running against them, and every lost second could be fatal. The restaurant lights, once soft and inviting, now seemed too bright, almost blinding as panic began to spread among the patrons. Isabella, feeling weaker by the moment, held Eduardo's hand tightly, who desperately looked around for a solution. That night, which began as a celebration of love, was turning into a nightmare. The sense of despair was palpable, and deep down, everyone knew time was running out. Something had to be done, and quickly. But what? When health is at stake, every decision, every action can determine the outcome. And here at that moment, Isabella's fate was about to change drastically. In that sophisticated restaurant, where luxury was the standard and the service impeccable, Isabella couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that had suddenly appeared. The atmosphere, which initially seemed the perfect setting for the celebration, was now filled with a heavy, uneasy tension. It was as if the air had become denser, and each breath was more difficult. There are moments in life when our bodies perceive things that our minds have yet to comprehend, and this was one of those moments for Isabella. She tried to ignore it, to distract herself with light conversation with Eduardo, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Eduardo, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to any discomfort. He continued talking about future plans, about how they could renew their vows in an even grander ceremony, but his words seemed to echo in a void for Isabella. The unease inside her was growing, a premonition that something was about to happen. Perhaps you felt this before, a discomfort that can't be explained but refuses to go away. It's like the body, in its silent wisdom, is trying to send a warning. Isabella looked around, searching for something to justify her sudden anxiety, but everything appeared normal, at least on the surface. When the dishes began to be served, Isabella's discomfort intensified. The aroma of the food, which under any other circumstances would have been delicious, now seemed nauseating, almost sickening. She tried to maintain her composure, the elegant posture that always accompanied her, but she couldn't help but notice that her appetite had completely disappeared. Eduardo, noticing that she was barely touching her food, asked if she was okay, and Isabella, with a forced smile, said she was. But inside, the discomfort was only growing. Intuition, that silent voice we often ignore, was screaming at her to pay attention. Looking at the shrimp on her plate, something inside Isabella hesitated. Could this dish, so carefully prepared, be the cause of her unease? But the thought that it could be poison seemed so absurd, so out of context, that she tried to dismiss it. However, with every bite, the feeling of discomfort increased. It was as if her body was rejecting the food, sending clear signals that something was wrong. But in such a refined and safe environment, who could imagine that a simple meal could turn into a life-threatening situation? The conversation between the couple became more sparse, with Isabella retreating further into her thoughts. The soft music playing in the background, once pleasant, now seemed like an irritating distraction. She could barely focus on what Eduardo was saying. Her mind was fixated on that feeling of impending danger. Every second seemed to drag on, and the certainty that something was about to happen only solidified. It was as if time was playing against her, offering clues that a storm was approaching, even though the sky outside remained clear and cloudless. Isabella knew she needed to do something, but she was paralyzed by a mix of fear and confusion. Should she trust her instincts and stop eating? Should she share her concerns with Eduardo, or continue pretending that everything was fine? These doubts swirled in her mind as the physical discomfort intensified. The restaurant, once a refuge of luxury and celebration, now felt like a stage where something terrible was about to happen. The atmosphere, so heavy, began to weigh not only on her mind but on her body, as if every fiber of her being was on high alert. And at that moment, amid the internal chaos, Isabella felt that the situation was about to unravel. At that moment, Isabella realized that the discomfort she was feeling wasn't just psychological. Her body was reacting in an alarming way. A wave of nausea overwhelmed her, and at first, she attributed the unease to the shrimp she had just eaten. Her mind began to connect the dots, and the suspicion that she was facing a case of food poisoning became unavoidable. But what initially seemed like a simple reaction, such as mild food poisoning, quickly escalated into something much more serious. Isabella couldn't ignore what her body was signaling. Something terribly wrong was happening inside her. As Eduardo observed his wife with growing concern, Isabella tried to explain what she was feeling, but the words came out confused and broken. The sense that her health was in immediate danger was real, but the cause remained a mystery to everyone. Was there something in that dish, or perhaps some other detail of the meal triggering such a violent reaction? Eduardo began to consider all the possibilities. Could it be a sudden allergy, or perhaps the shrimp were contaminated? The situation, which until then was merely discomfort, was now beginning to look like an emergency. With each passing minute, Isabella's symptoms worsened. It wasn't just the nausea, but also an intense weakness that seemed to drain all her energy. Eduardo, who was trying to stay calm, now found himself gripped by a feeling of helplessness. He knew something needed to be done immediately, but what? The restaurant, no matter how sophisticated and safe it seemed, was now seen by him as the possible culprit behind his wife's condition. He wondered if the kitchen had made a mistake or if, somehow, an external agent had contaminated the food. The looks exchanged between Eduardo and Isabella spoke more than any words could at that moment. The suspicion of food poisoning turned into pure fear as Isabella's condition deteriorated. Eduardo quickly stood up and called for help, while his mind raced with desperate thoughts. Could the chef provide some explanation? Or perhaps the maitre d' knew something? The only certainty at that moment was that time was against them, and Isabella's health was deteriorating alarmingly fast. What began as a suspicion quickly turned into a race against time. Panic began to set in not only in Eduardo, but also among the restaurant staff, who now found themselves in a situation completely out of their control. The possibility of poisoning became real and urgent, and all efforts were focused on understanding what had happened and, more importantly, how to save Isabella. She, in turn, felt that every second that passed was pulling her further away from the safety she so desperately sought. What do you do when the very food meant to nourish and satisfy becomes the cause of such a severe health crisis? The situation reached a critical point where every decision had to be quick and precise. Isabella, now feeling she was on the verge of something far more serious than simple food poisoning, began to wonder if she could survive this ordeal. Meanwhile, Eduardo, a mix of despair and determination, knew he had to act. But where to start? The food, that central element of the celebration, had turned into the epicenter of a potential disaster. And in that moment, the questions about what was really happening and how they could reverse the situation became urgent and essential for Isabella's survival. The situation was becoming unbearable, and Isabella, now visibly weakened, was at the mercy of something no one could clearly identify. Eduardo, seeing his wife in such a state, felt a growing desperation inside him. He knew that time was running out and that he needed to act quickly to save the woman he loved so much. The restaurant, with all its luxury and sophistication, had turned into a battleground against the clock, where every second lost could be decisive. Eduardo called for the manager and demanded that they call an ambulance, but chaos was already setting in, and everyone seemed to be in shock at the gravity of the situation. The restaurant staff, well trained for ordinary situations, found themselves completely unprepared to handle such a critical medical emergency. The chef, upon being informed of Isabella's condition, immediately ordered that all the food be re-examined in the hope of identifying what could have gone wrong with the dish. Waiters rushed back and forth, trying to offer assistance, while other customers watched, stunned, as the events unfolded. The night, which was supposed to be an intimate and joyful celebration, was turning into a scene of collective despair, with everyone trying to do something but not knowing exactly how to help. Meanwhile, Eduardo tried to keep Isabella conscious, talking to her, holding her hand and begging her to hold on. But the weakness overtaking her was evident, and he began to realize they needed more than simple first aid. The fear of losing Isabella consumed him, and every breath she took seemed like a monumental effort. He began to recall stories of people who had gone through similar situations and survived, but no memory brought him comfort. What do you do when it seems like all the options are running out and the person you love most is on the brink of collapse? The restaurant staff, in a final effort to help, began searching the establishment's records for any information about allergies or ingredients that could have caused such a violent reaction. But time was ticking, and the ambulance had yet to arrive. Eduardo, in an act of desperation, asked if any customer who was a doctor could step forward in the hope that someone could offer an immediate solution. The situation was becoming increasingly critical, and the sense of helplessness loomed over everyone. Isabella's life was hanging by a thread, and any help seemed insufficient at that moment. Meanwhile, Isabella, feeling her body weaken with every passing second, began to lose consciousness. The voices around her, once so clear, now seemed distant, as if she were drifting away from everything. Eduardo, realizing what was happening, fell into total panic. He knew he couldn't lose Isabella, but at the same time, he felt completely powerless in the face of the situation. It was as if the world was collapsing around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The restaurant, which once felt so safe and welcoming, was now a place of terror, where his wife's life was on the line. In the midst of this chaos, the ambulance finally arrived, and the paramedics quickly entered the restaurant ready to act. But Isabella's condition had deteriorated to the point where even they knew every second counted. Eduardo, now alongside the paramedics, watched in shock as they did everything they could to stabilize her. The feeling of despair was overwhelming, but a small spark of hope still burned within him. Maybe, with the help of the professionals, there was a chance to save Isabella. But what Eduardo didn't know yet was that fate was about to throw yet another unexpected twist into their lives. As soon as the ambulance arrived at the restaurant, panic took over completely. What had been just a tense evening had now turned into a chaotic scene, where every detail contributed to the growing confusion. The ambience, so carefully prepared for a celebration, was now immersed in an atmosphere of fear and despair. Customers, who had been enjoying their own meals, stopped everything to watch the events unfold. The situation had spiraled out of control, and the only thing left was to hope that the professionals could bring some order to the chaos. The paramedics quickly took control of the situation, but the tension in the air was palpable. As Isabella was placed on a stretcher, Eduardo found himself in a state of total confusion. Driven by fear and adrenaline, he could barely process what was happening around him. Everything seemed like a blur. The faces of the people, the voices, the sounds of the sirens. He knew he needed to stay strong, but at that moment, panic had consumed him. What should have been a simple anniversary celebration had turned into a fight for his wife's survival, and he felt completely powerless. The confusion wasn't limited to the couple. The entire restaurant was in a state of disarray. The staff, who were normally organized and efficient, were now running around trying to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Some employees were still trying to find an explanation for what had happened, while others simply froze, unable to react to the severity of the situation. The chef, who had once commanded the kitchen with a firm hand, was now at a loss, not knowing if he was responsible for something so tragic. It was a scene of panic and confusion, where everyone was searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. As the paramedics worked tirelessly to stabilize Isabella, the sense of urgency grew. Eduardo, seeing his wife in such a fragile state, felt the weight of the situation press down on him more and more. He wanted to do something, anything to help, but everything seemed beyond his reach. The confusion in his mind mirrored the chaos around him, where nothing made sense. There were many questions and few answers, and the fear of losing Isabella dominated him with every passing second. How had everything come to this point? And more importantly, how would they get out of this situation? The restaurant, which had once echoed with the sound of lively conversations and laughter, was now in complete silence, except for the worried murmurs of those present. The tension was almost tangible, and each second seemed to stretch on, laden with the weight of uncertainty. The other customers watched the scene with expressions of shock and concern, some offering silent prayers, others simply paralyzed by the fear of what might happen next. The atmosphere, once so full of life, was now saturated with the panic and confusion that consumed everyone in the room. Finally, the paramedics began to move Isabella toward the ambulance, but the sense of urgency didn't diminish. Eduardo, now accompanying his wife to the vehicle, knew that the journey to the hospital would only be the beginning of another battle. The panic inside him mixed with the need to stay calm, but it was impossible to ignore the confusion that still overwhelmed him. Every thought running through his mind seemed tangled, and the only thing clear was that Isabella needed immediate help. The chaos around him continued, but inside a determination began to emerge. He would do whatever it took to save her, no matter what it required. As the ambulance raced through the city streets, Eduardo remained by Isabella's side, trying to find some comfort in the presence of the paramedics, who were diligently working to keep her stable. The situation was critical, and the look on the medical professionals' faces left no doubt. Every second counted. Isabella, now drifting in and out of consciousness, seemed to be fighting an internal battle against something still unknown to everyone. It was at this moment of extreme tension that an unexpected turn began to take shape, involving someone who until then had been just a distant bystander. Sophia, a cleaning staff member at the hospital where Isabella was being taken, vividly remembered a similar case that had occurred years before. At the time, she had closely watched as a patient exhibited similar symptoms, and it was only thanks to the quick action of an experienced doctor that the patient was saved. The antidote used in that situation was something Sophia had never forgotten, a memory stored with a mix of relief and admiration. Realizing the severity of Isabella's situation, Sophia made a bold decision. She needed to act and share her recollection with the medical team, even though her role at the hospital was different. Upon arrival at the hospital, while the doctors rushed to save Isabella, Sophia, with some hesitation, approached one of the nurses. Her voice was firm despite her nervousness as she described the case she had witnessed years ago, suggesting that perhaps the antidote used back then could be what Isabella needed now. The nurse, surprised, decided not to dismiss the comment. She knew that in situations like this, any clue, no matter how improbable, could mean the difference between life and death. With that, the medical team quickly began investigating whether that antidote could be applied in Isabella's case. As the doctors discussed the viability of the antidote, Eduardo, still in shock, watched everything from a distance, not fully understanding what was happening. He could hardly believe that the situation had escalated to this point, from a celebration to a race for life in just a few hours. When they finally explained to him that there was a chance, however slim, that the antidote suggested by Sophia might work, he clung to that hope like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. It was a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness that surrounded them. The next few minutes were filled with intense tension. The medical team decided to administer the antidote, with all the risks involved, because the alternatives were few and time was running out. Eduardo watched, heart in his throat, as the antidote was prepared and finally given to Isabella. All he could do was wait and pray that Sophia, in her courageous act, was right. The situation was so delicate that any mistake could be fatal, but at that moment Eduardo knew this was the only chance to save his wife. When the antidote began to take effect, Isabella's vital signs slowly started to stabilize. There was still a long road ahead, and the doctors made it clear that the battle was far from won. But Sophia's intervention had given Isabella the first real chance to survive that terrible night. Eduardo, unable to hold back tears, thanked everyone present, but he knew that a special gratitude was owed to the staff member who, despite her role, decided to act with courage and compassion. And so, in an atmosphere still charged with tension, a faint hope emerged that Isabella might overcome this nightmare. The antidote administered to Isabella brought a brief sense of relief to everyone around, but reality soon set in. Her condition was still critical, and the doctors knew they had to act quickly to ensure her survival. The hospital, accustomed to handling all sorts of emergencies, now found itself in a frantic race against time. Lights flashed in the emergency rooms, the hurried footsteps of professionals echoed through the corridors, and Eduardo, overwhelmed by a mix of hope and fear, couldn't take his eyes off his wife. With each passing second, he knew they were closer to a resolution, whatever that might be. A swift decision was made. Isabella needed to be transferred to a specialized center that could provide the necessary resources to treat her case. The medical team organized everything with precision, but the tension was evident on everyone's faces. Eduardo, who could barely process the information he was receiving, was informed that the transport would be immediate and he could accompany her. The journey to the specialized center seemed like an eternity. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, the siren piercing the quiet of the night, Eduardo clung to Isabella's hand, who was still fighting for her life. During the ride, the silence among the paramedics was filled only with the constant sound of the machines monitoring Isabella. Every sharp turn, every abrupt stop, felt like a test of her resilience and of Eduardo's heart, which was on the verge of despair. His mind wandered between memories of what should have been one of the best nights of their lives and the nightmare that the celebration had turned into. His worry was so overwhelming that he hardly noticed the passage of time. but he knew that every minute inside that ambulance was crucial to give Isabella a chance to survive. Upon arriving at the specialized center, a new medical team was ready to receive Isabella. The ambulance doors opened, and a quick sequence of actions was set in motion, each professional knowing exactly what to do. Eduardo was led to a waiting room, where the weight of the night finally began to take its toll on him. Sitting in a hard chair, surrounded by white, sterile walls, he realized that, for the first time, he was alone. All the chaos and action that had kept him distracted until then had vanished, leaving only silence and uncertainty. The doctors continued to work tirelessly, performing a series of procedures in an attempt to reverse the damage caused by the poisoning. Eduardo knew that, at that moment, his presence could do nothing more than wait. The hours passed in a blur, and he found himself consumed by dark thoughts about what the future might hold for him and Isabella. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel grateful to all those who had mobilized to save his wife's life. Even though the outcome was still uncertain, he knew that no one could have done more. Finally, a doctor entered the waiting room, bringing the news Eduardo had dreaded hearing. Isabella was stable but still in critical condition and would need intensive monitoring in the coming hours. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope that she might recover. Eduardo, exhausted and emotionally drained, allowed himself to exhale a sigh of relief. The journey so far had been arduous, but he knew that alongside Isabella, he would face whatever challenges lay ahead. And although the shadows still loomed, there was a path forward that he was determined to walk with her. The days following Isabella's emergency were marked by a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had overcome the worst, but she was still under intensive care, with doctors closely monitoring her recovery. Eduardo, always by her side, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong beyond the poisoning. It was as if a greater mystery was lurking in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Conversations with the doctors, details about Isabella's symptoms, everything seemed to point to a cause that wasn't accidental. And it was in this atmosphere of silent tension that the truth began to emerge, forever changing the course of their lives. As Isabella recovered, a parallel investigation was underway. The medical team, intrigued by the nature of her symptoms and the effectiveness of the antidote, started raising questions about what really happened that fateful night. It didn't take long for suspicions to turn toward Eduardo, the seemingly devoted husband who had stayed by her side throughout the ordeal. There was something about the sequence of events that didn't add up, and small details which initially seemed insignificant began to reveal a story of betrayal that no one could have imagined. Eduardo, who had appeared concerned and anxious about Isabella's recovery, began to act strangely as the investigation progressed. His reactions, once seen as a result of stress, now seemed calculated. That's when investigators discovered something shocking. Eduardo had made a series of suspicious financial moves in the weeks leading up to their wedding anniversary. He had taken out a large life insurance policy on Isabella, and records showed that he had contacted a person of dubious reputation, known for involvement in obscure poisoning cases. The truth came to light like an avalanche. Eduardo had planned to poison Isabella that night with the intent of gaining access to her wealth. The pieces of the puzzle fit together in a cruel and devastating way. The shrimp dish, carefully chosen, wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of a meticulously crafted plan. Eduardo, whom everyone thought was a loving husband, was revealed to be a traitor, willing to take his wife's life to achieve his own goals. The betrayal was so deep that it left an indelible mark on the lives of everyone who knew the couple. When Eduardo was confronted with the evidence, he initially tried to deny it, but the pressure of the proof was overwhelming. He eventually confessed, admitting that he had planned everything down to the smallest detail, from choosing the restaurant to the moment he would administer the poison. Isabella, still recovering, was informed of the terrible truth in small doses to avoid compromising her fragile health. The shock was overwhelming. The person she trusted most had tried to kill her. But instead of being defeated by this revelation, Isabella began to gather strength, determined to face this new reality with courage. Eduardo was arrested, and the case became a media sensation, shocking everyone who followed the story. Even in her weakened state, Isabella decided she would not be a silent victim. She was determined to turn the betrayal into a turning point in her life. With the help of friends, lawyers, and surprisingly Sophia, the staff member who had been crucial in saving her life, Isabella began planning her next steps. She knew she couldn't simply move on without doing something to help other people who, like her, might be in dangerous situations, often without knowing it. The revelation of Eduardo's betrayal deeply shook Isabella's life, but it also brought out a strength she didn't know she had. Amid this turmoil, she found an unexpected ally, Sophia, the hospital staff member who had acted with courage and instinct, not only saved her life, but also became a central figure in her recovery. Sophia, who had always worked behind the scenes, was now at Isabella's side, offering support and understanding. The friendship that formed between them was surprising, yet natural. Both had gone through difficult times, and this connection turned into a powerful alliance. Isabella, who had always been reserved, found in Sophia a confidant. They spent hours talking about everything that had happened, and Sophia, with her practical outlook on life, helped Isabella process the betrayal and rebuild her confidence. The relationship between the two wasn't just based on gratitude, but on a mutual respect that grew each day. Sophia, who once saw Isabella as distant and unapproachable, now saw her as a friend, someone she could rely on. And Isabella, in turn, found in Sophia a quiet strength that inspired her to move forward. Together, they began to explore ways to turn all that pain into something positive. Isabella, still recovering physically, used the time to plan how she could help other women who, like her, had suffered in silence. Sophia, with her life experience and practical sense, brought valuable ideas. They talked about creating an NGO that could offer support to women who were victims of violence and betrayal, a place where they could find safety, emotional support, and above all, a network of people willing to help. The project, which started as a simple idea, quickly took shape. Sophia's support was crucial for Isabella to move forward. She helped not only with practical matters, but also emotionally, always being there when Isabella needed her most. Sophia, who had always been a woman of few words, showed her true strength through her actions. And in this way, the alliance between the two solidified, with each bringing something unique to the partnership. Isabella, with her resources and visibility, and Sophia, with her life experience and resilience, formed an unbeatable team determined to make a difference in the lives of other women. As the NGO project gained momentum, Isabella and Sophia realized that this new mission was more than just a way to deal with the past. It was a purpose that gave meaning to everything they had gone through. The two women, who initially came from such different worlds, now shared a common goal that united them in a way that few could understand. The trauma Isabella had suffered was no longer just a scar. It was the driving force that propelled her to create something that could impact the lives of many others. And Sophia, who had always been a quiet fighter, found in her friendship with Isabella a new reason to keep fighting. Isabella and Sophia knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were prepared to face the challenges together. With each meeting, each step taken towards establishing the NGO, their friendship grew stronger. The alliance that was forged in adversity proved to be unbreakable, and the two knew that no matter what the future held, they could always count on each other. And so, amidst the chaos and pain, something powerful was born. A friendship forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the desire to change the world one woman at a time. What began as a personal tragedy transformed into a movement of empowerment and advocacy. Isabella and Sophia, with their painful experiences, became the voices behind a greater cause. The NGO they started to develop was created to be more than just a refuge. It would be a beacon for all the women who, at some point, had felt trapped in situations of abuse or betrayal. The mission was clear: to offer support, shelter, and above all, to restore the dignity and personal power of every woman who crossed their path. Isabella's pain would not be in vain. It would become the seed of something great. Isabella, using her influence and resources, began to draw attention to the cause. She used her own story as a living example of what the NGO could do for other women. In interviews, speeches, and events, she spoke with eloquence and passion about the importance of breaking the silence and seeking help. Every word was loaded with authenticity because it came from someone who deeply understood the pain she was describing. The image of a wealthy and powerful woman who almost lost everything by trusting someone blindly served to humanize the cause, making it even more impactful. Sophia, always discreet, worked behind the scenes, ensuring that every detail of the NGO aligned with the vision she and Isabella shared. Her practical experience and keen eye for the real needs of the women they served made the NGO stand out from the start. She knew that it wasn't enough to offer shelter. It was necessary to build a support system that empowered these women to restart their lives with dignity. Sophia's work was crucial in making sure the NGO wasn't just one among many, but an institution that truly made a difference. As time passed, the NGO began to grow, attracting volunteers, donations, and strategic partnerships. The impact began to be felt in various communities, where women who once lived in fear now found the courage to start anew. The story of Isabella and Sophia, which began with pain and betrayal, now inspired thousands of other women to rise and fight for their own lives. The strength of the friendship between them, forged under such adverse circumstances, became the pillar upon which the NGO stood. And the further they advanced, the clearer it became that this was a journey without a return, a commitment to social change that motivated them every day. The hard work brought visible results, but Isabella and Sophia knew that the fight against violence and abuse was ongoing. Every success story was celebrated, but each new case brought to light the reality that there was much more to be done. The journey of empowerment and advocacy they chose to follow had no end, but this didn't discourage them. On the contrary, each new challenge served as fuel for their determination. Isabella, now stronger than ever, and Sophia, with her quiet courage, continued to fight, knowing they were creating a legacy that would endure. The NGO, born out of pain, grew and became a symbol of hope and resilience. Isabella and Sophia could never have imagined how much their lives would change after that night at the restaurant, but now, looking back, they saw that every step, no matter how painful, had led them to this moment of impact and transformation. The power of women's empowerment and the defense of human rights became the central message of their lives, and they were determined to continue spreading this message. What began as a personal tragedy had transformed into an inexhaustible source of strength, not just for them, but for all the women who would follow in their footsteps. And so, after such an intense and transformative journey, the lesson is clear. Life can surprise us in unimaginable ways, but it's our ability to turn pain into strength that truly defines who we are. Isabella and Sophia didn't let circumstances defeat them. Instead, they used each challenge as a stepping stone to something greater. And that's a lesson we can all apply in our lives. How many times do we find ourselves in situations that seem impossible to overcome? But it's precisely in those moments that we have the opportunity to discover the strength within us. Now I ask you, what are you doing with the adversities you face in your life? Are you letting them defeat you, or are you using each one as a chance to grow, learn, and perhaps even help others? Isabella and Sophia's story shows us that no matter how difficult the path, there is always a way out, and often that way leads us to a better destination than we imagined. So, what will you do with this new perspective? Will you stay in the same place, or will you take the next step toward your own empowerment? I encourage you to reflect on this and share your thoughts in the comments. After all, your experience can also inspire others to move forward, just as Isabella and Sophia's story inspired so many others. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't waste any more time. Turn on notifications to keep learning about how to turn challenges into opportunities and make your life a story of overcoming and success. This is just the beginning of a journey of self-discovery and empowerment, and I'm here to accompany you every step of the way. Shall we go together?